What
Yeah.
is that the title?
Yeah, the thing is that some of you know what happened. I had cause to change this paper significantly over the last 2 weeks. So whereas before it was sort of a discussion of perfection and various senses of perfection, now it's directed to the question of what's the place of the inferior monads in the system, and what's their hope for a better future. All right, as you know, the Leibniz stuff tends to be technical and lengthy and boring, so forgive me for that. I got some handouts with the longer quotes on there so you don't get totally lost in the speed reading that I'll try to do of them, so you don't have to listen for ever and ever.
Anyone see?
All right. Here we go. One recent trend among Leibniz scholars has been movement away from the Russell-Kuderow reading of Leibniz philosophy toward more systematic interpretations, according to which theodicy plays at least as great a role in Leibniz logic as in the development of his thought. That would be, plays at least as great a role as Leibniz logic does in the development of his thought. Although along with this trend has come a tendency to find harmonies rather than tensions among Leibniz views. Before, everything was about finding tensions within Leibniz. This reconciling attitude and the attention it's directed towards motivations behind Leibniz's system has in many ways resulted in much more coherent readings of his work than earlier interpretations, so that so often found this logical mathematical genius to be woefully inconsistent. While this is without doubt an excellent outcome, it may have resulted in overly narrow analyses of this rich work. Some authors, in their concern for Leibniz's theological motivation, have given too little attention to the non-rational monads, those that in fact comprise the vast majority of created being. In my own analysis, I wish to focus, as have many, on Leibniz's notion of the most perfect world, as it's derived from God's goodness, but with an eye to the place and future of the dumber monads, being democratic. It's well known that Leibniz describes rational monads as infinitely superior to those he calls simple, mere, or bare. Because of the implications of rational monads' self-awareness, these monads are often portrayed as effectively different in kind from their simpler counterparts, and with good reason. Leibniz touts their incomparable value and favor in God's eyes in several places. It would seem, however, that Leibniz metaphysics will not support such an absolute distinction between the rational, non-rational, and mere monads. Moreover, in his considered view, Leibniz seems to be aware of this, and there's even reason to think that his more radical claims in this area may be reasonably understood to acknowledge the place and value of these lesser substances. My method in making my case will be to consider Leibniz's various explications of his notion of perfection and all of their interrelations, ultimately showing that as he uses the concept, there's no justification in his system for any radical distinction between radical and lesser substances that God chooses to create. In fact, I'll ultimately argue that a thorough consideration of the notion of perfection in all the various senses it assumes reveals that Leibniz's theological optimism is even greater than those who have ridiculed him could ever imagine. So, let's begin with Leibniz's most recognized characterization of the perfection of monads, as the perfection of their expression, or put more commonly, the distinctness of their perceptions. Leibniz says that a monad has perfection in proportion to the distinctness of its perceptions. The statement, first of all, involves a major ambiguity. Should we understand Leibniz to be suggesting that monads' relative perfection is to be determined according to the proportion of their distinct perceptions relative to their indistinct ones? Or that in a more general sense, monads must be ranked proportionally to or relative to the degree of distinctness generally of their perceptions? If the former, then some formula must exist for determining the proportion of distinct perceptions to confused ones. If the latter, then questions arise whether the distinction of a monad's perception is to be considered from the point of view of a set, with the ranking based upon the total, or whether instead a monad's relative perfection is determined according to the average degree of distinctness of its perceptions, or perhaps by the most distinct perceptions of which it's capable. Before answering that question, though, I must address some preliminary points. Immediately arising from this characterization of a perfection are questions regarding such issues as what counts as a perception. Leibniz says that a perception is a passing state which enfolds and represents a multitude in unity, or in the simple substance. Okay, fine, but where do these states start and stop? We know how broad or extensive a perception is, since each reflects the whole world at some level. But the length of a perception seems more problematic. And as states, they seem to be separable entities that ultimately add up to a complete substance. This is a fortunate characterization in one way, for it brings to attention the eternal nature of monads rather than suggesting, as the term perception does, a temporal event. Even as states, though, perceptions can't be considered discrete entities or even be said to have sharp boundaries, for the law of continuity would surely preclude that. Even so, they must in some way be distinguishable. How to manage a continuum of states, fortunately, is a problem that can be left for others, for however perceptions are to be distinguished, Leibniz clearly thinks that monads proceed by appetition from one of them to the next, and so there must be some number of them, although even that, considering that monads are eternal, would require some unpacking. Another preliminary point concerns only the first possible interpretation listed above, where perfection is determined according to the proportion of a monad's distinct perceptions relative to its indistinct ones. On this interpretation, which has been endorsed by Donald Rutherford, among others, what God would apparently do in ranking monads is to count up the distinct perceptions that a monad has, count up the indistinct or the confused ones, and come up with a ratio. This seems to presume that there's some threshold beyond which perceptions count as distinct. How could there be such a cutoff point, though, given Leibniz's principle of the continuum, according to which nature makes no leaps? Even leaving that question aside and allowing that the ratio in question should be determined by, say, the most obviously distinct ones, the paradigm cases, we still have a major problem. Many, indeed most monads, the ones that concern us here, have no distinct perceptions whatsoever. As Leibniz says at Monadology 24, the perceptions of naked monads have nothing distinct, or so to speak, in relief, or stronger in flavor in them. If none of these bare monads, those that Leibniz says are always in a state of stupor, has any distinct perceptions at all, then it's difficult to see how God could rank them according to a proportion involving some number of them. Using the actual number of their distinct perceptions, 0, wouldn't work, because then the monads in question would all have the same proportion of distinct to confused perceptions, and so they would all be equally perfect and thus identical, according to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. One final difficulty, although a less formidable one, although it's turning out not to be, for the project of defining relative perfection of monads in terms of the proportion of their distinct perceptions, concerns the structure of those perceptions that are unquestionably distinct. Leibniz says that each distinct perception includes an infinity of confused perceptions which envelop the entire universe. And this presents a problem, particularly in light of Leibniz's rhetorical question in the Theodicy, for how can I know, and can I present infinities to you and compare them together? Well, if comparing infinities is such a difficulty as Leibniz suggests here, he's going to face no end of trouble in articulating, much less supporting his whole view. Other times, though, he's more optimistic about the possibility of comparing the infinities involved in individual monads, and indeed in whole worlds, and so we'll follow his more usual example and forge ahead. The resolution of this extra complexity might go something like this. Starting from any perception that contains some measure of distinctness, which we might call the main perception in one of these complexes, there would have to be included along with it, or internal to it, given the principle of the continuum, an infinite gradation of increasingly confused perceptions, approaching the limit of complete confusion, or no perception. This doesn't appear to leave us any worse off than we already were with respect to comparing the relative perfection of the main perceptions, though, since the infinities of accompanying confused perceptions would seem to be of the same size, and so would cancel out in the comparison process. This is because if the infinity of confused perceptions accompanying each distinct perception is constant, and it seems that it ought to be, since each monad perceives the same universe from a finite perspective, then plugging the constant into the equation of distinct to confused perceptions would make no difference in the relative proportion of distinct to confused perceptions, or in other words, it would make no difference to the relative perfection of the monads having those perceptions. Perhaps given the difficulties with understanding relative perfection in terms of a proportion, the better suggestion for how to read Leibniz's claim is the second one offered, according to which we should think of monads as perfect proportional to or relative to the distinctness of their perceptions. There seems to be a way to do this that avoids the problems mentioned in the introduction to this section, given that a perception that lacks distinctness remains a perception and thus is an expression of the universe. Consider the possibility that the measurement according to which relative perfection is determined concerns the relative access a monad's perceptions have to the intelligibility of the universe. That is, consider distinctness of expression or perception in terms of the information content of a monad's perceptions. Or in other words, in terms of the relative nearness of a monad's perceptions to God's perfect understanding, which Leibniz describes in the Principles of Nature and Grace in terms of perfect distinctness. To begin unpacking this reading, note first that Leibniz identifies perfection of a world with its affirmative intelligibility. In a 1715 letter to Christian Wolff, he says, you've got this quote, that perfection about which you ask is the degree of positive reality, or what comes to the same thing, the degree of affirmative intelligibility. So that something more perfect is something in which more things worthy of observation are found. Two things, it seems, would be involved in accessing this intelligibility. Whatever information each distinct perception provides regarding the positive qualities of a thing, and the information conveying the order that exists among those qualities. To understand this more fully, think of the information content of a monad's perceptions as encoded in some language, at least as composed of some discrete bits. Ideally, in the rational monad's case, you could do this in terms of his universal characteristic. On this understanding, all perceptions of whatever degree of distinctness, even those of the bare monads, which have nothing of a strong flavor in them, necessarily do nevertheless have some flavor. That is, they have something that's in some way explicit or stands out more, that would in some way be analogous and so quantifiable. The more information content of a particular perception, the more distinct it would be. And thus, the relative perfection of all monads would be discernible. In the process of explaining another way of describing the perfection of things, Leibniz says that the more that's worthy of observation in a thing, or the more information it possesses, the more harmony or order it contains. The outer limit of such perfection is, of course, God's intellect. And this is your second quote. I'm astonished that you think, that you ask what it is to be more regular, since I've already shown that it is that which provides more general rules or more general observations. Nothing is more regular than the divine intellect, which is the source of all rules, and produces the most regular, that is, the most perfect system of the world, the system that is as harmonious as possible, and thus contains the greatest number of general observations. So God's mind, it turns out, and obviously correctly, contains the most information because it is the source of all regulation, order, or rules. This would suggest that God's perfectly distinct perception of the positive qualities of things provides a complete analysis of their interrelations. And as the source of both the things that are related and their order, God both provides and perceives the unity in the multiplicity. Thus it would seem that the more distinctly any monad perceives, the more information content its perceptions contain, both in terms of positive properties and in terms of order. That is, the more distinctly a monad perceives, the more it's able to subsume a number of phenomena under general rules or general observations. Or in other terms, the more unity it's able to both bring and discover to the multiplicity. In the case of bare monads, the same unity and multiplicity is to be found, as various perceptions of the world are brought together in the same mind to both create and perceive some information content, although in some of these cases it's remarkably little. Now, not only is Leibniz interested in perfection as a relative measure of excellence, he's also concerned with perfections as positive qualities constitutive of reality. As Leibniz notes in Discourse Meditations 1, it's convenient to notice that there are several entirely different perfections in nature, that God possesses them all together, and that each one belongs to him in a supreme degree. The perfections to which Leibniz here refers are clearly qualities, but not all qualities count among the perfections, for perfections include only those qualities that are simple, positive, and absolute. Leibniz continues in Discourse on Meditation 1, this is on your page, with his description of perfections in this sense. A fairly sure test for being a perfection is that forms or natures that are not capable of a highest degree are not perfections, as for example, the nature of number or figure. For the greatest of all numbers, or even the number of all numbers, as well as the greatest of all figures, imply contradiction. But the greatest knowledge and omnipotence do not involve any impossibility. Consequently, power and knowledge are perfections, and insofar as they belong to God, they do not have limits. Since goodness as well as power and knowledge is capable of a highest degree, it as well counts as a perfection. Thus, Leibniz argues that there's both metaphysical perfection and moral perfection in the world. In this sense, then, perfections are infinities of particular sorts, the highest degree of reality or intensity of certain properties. Robert Adams says that going from talk of perfections as infinite qualities in God to perfection as quantity of essence or reality involves a shift in the notion of perfection, from one which is a matter of existence or not, to one which is a matter of degree. It would seem to me, though, that since God is absolutely perfect, while creatures are perfect only to some degree, the shift that takes place between these usages is simply a question of adaptation, since the second's clearly derived from the first. If perfections in God just are the qualities from which all created beings come into existence, as Leibniz says, by a kind of emanation, that is, then the perfection of an individual substance could quite coherently be understood as the degree of its participation in these essences. According to Christian Mercer, created beings result from God's nature overflowing into created beings that instantiate God's perfections, although in an inferior way. Each creature in this way shares to some degree in God, and God exists in each individual while remaining transcendent. It's a really good trick that God came up with. God's perfections are the reason for the measure of perfection in individual substances on this account, precisely because the quantity of perfection in a given substance, and by extension in the world, is a function of the degree to which that created being instantiates God's perfections. In what appears to be a record of a conversation with a German statesman, Baron somebody, Leibniz says that I've got his name, I just can't say. Leibniz says that the original imperfection of created beings arises from the very essences or natures of created things. For the essences of things are eternal, even though things aren't. God's understanding is the source of the essences of created things, such as they are in him, that is, bounded. If they're imperfect, one can only blame their limitation on their boundaries, that is to say, the extent of their participation in nothingness. As the attributes exist in God, they're infinite, absolute, and so perfect, thus God's perfections. But as they're limited to create the essence of finite things, they are imperfect individually and even considered altogether, although together they create the greatest perfection possible. Thus, in a 1677 letter to Arnold Eckhart, in what he calls his preferred definition, Leibniz says that perfection is degree or quantity of reality or essence, as intensity of quality, as intensity is a degree of quality, and force is degree of action. Perfection in this sense as well, then, must accrue to some degree in the inferior monads, or they couldn't exist. Among the perfections of God, and the ones to which Leibniz gives most attention, are, as we noted above, omnipotence, omniscience, and goodness. As we've also noted, the perfections in contingent beings arise from limitations of God's perfections. Consider now Leibniz's specific claim in the monadology that created beings are perfect to the extent that they imitate God's power, will, and knowledge. First of all, with respect to God, Leibniz says that there is in God the power, which is the source of everything. There is also the knowledge, which contains the variety of the ideas. And finally, there is the will, which makes changes or products in accordance with the principle of the best. Again, in God, these attributes are absolutely infinite or perfect. And in created monads, they are nothing but imitations in the degree to which the monad has perfection. Is a quote. Let's begin our examination of these attributes with power, or the ability to be and to create, which in God's case is absolute. In created substances, Leibniz says this power is the subject or basis. As we've seen, it's God's essences or ideas that provide the ontological stuff from which all other things arise. Leibniz says in his supplement to on transubstantiation that idea is the union of God and creatures, so that the action of agent and patient is one. A point is at once common to two lines or intersectors. Most apt of all, an angle is at once center and lines. There are no ideas in God except as there are things outside of him. All things other than God, the necessary being and requisite of everything else, thus arise from the divine intellect and exist as a function of God's perfect power. Created beings share in this power of constituting the being of things, in this case phenomena, as was suggested above, through their intellectual representation. Leibniz says it can even be said that every substance in some way bears the character of God's infinite wisdom and impotence, and imitates him as much as it's capable. For it expresses, however confusedly, everything that takes place in the universe, past, present, or future. This resembles somewhat an infinite perception, or an infinite knowledge. And since all other substances in their turn express this one in their own way and adapt themselves to it, it can be said that each extends its power over all the rest in imitation of the omnipotence of the Creator. The difference between power in God, who is pure act, since he's most perfect, and power in individual created substances, does not consist in scope, but rather in degree of efficacy or control with respect to the whole universe. All monads contribute to the constitution of the universe through their harmonized perceptions. But because they only imperfectly imitate the divine power, all monads both act and suffer with respect to one another. So, bottom of the first page. For as all created substances are a continual production of the same sovereign being in accordance with the same plans, and are an expression of the same universe and the same phenomena, they harmonize exactly among themselves, and that causes us to say that one acts upon another, because one is a more distinct expression than the other of the cause or the reason for the changes. This is how, in my opinion, one must understand the commerce between created substances. Leibniz equates activity with distinctness of perception, and again, in comparison with God's infinite powers, with degree of perfection. As he puts it in the monadology, the created being is said to act outwardly insofar as it has perfection, and to suffer from another insofar as it's imperfect. Thus, action is attributed to a monad insofar as it has distinct perceptions, and passion insofar as it has confused ones. Whereas God's perceptions are perfectly distinct, created substances are in very large part confused and sometimes totally nearly so. That would be nearly totally so for those of you who are not dyslexic. Thus, the perfection activity of created substances is limited as it must be coordinated with that of all other substances. This is on your sheet. It's in this way that actions and passions are mutual among creatures. For God, comparing two simple substances, finds the reasons in each which oblige him to adapt the other to it, with the result that whatever is active in certain respects is passive considered from another point. Active insofar as what we distinctly know in it serves as a reason for what happens in another, but passive insofar as the reason for what happens in it is found in what we know distinctly in another. Power, then, or influence over the universe, for since a change in one substance, because of the interconnectedness of all, affects a change in all, is for Leibniz to be equated with activity, which in turn is equated with distinctness of perceptions, and accrues to all created substances in proper measure. The second correspondence Leibniz mentions between specific perfections in God and their counterparts in created substances is knowledge, which is omniscience in God and the perceptive faculty in created beings. First, we should note that here, as with the first of God's perfections discussed, Leibniz frames the counterpart property in created beings in terms applicable equally throughout the hierarchy of monads. We've said that distinctness of perception is directly related to the amount of information content carried, in the terms of both the constitutions of individual things and their interrelations. God's understanding, we've said, is the source of all the essences of which created things are constituted, as well as the rules of order. Possessing all information, then, God's intellect is absolute. Created substances, as well, perceive essences. And some are able to impose and discover order, and are more perfect to the degree that they're able to do so. While all monads in their own way express all existence in the universe, and the truths that follow from them, they don't perceive them with equal degrees of distinctness, nor does one soul perceive these things with the same degree of distinctness over time. What's more, with respect to those truths that are the result of God's choice, they can never be perceived by any created minds with perfect distinctness, because first of all, we must use information provided by the senses to acquire knowledge of them, contingent truths, and that's always confused. And second, as their proof requires an infinity of steps, perfect knowledge of such things is in principle not possible for finite minds. Created souls, even the rational ones called minds, can never know with perfect distinctness. For first of all, they're created in degrees of perfection that can never reach as far as the infinite. Second, as we've noted above, the distinctness of perception among monads is a matter of coordination. For as the distinctness of representation by one monad increases, that of the others must correspondingly decrease. According to the third correlation Leibniz makes between God's perfections and their counterparts in created substances, the infinite will of God is to be compared to the appetitive faculty in created beings. Appetite, which corresponds to will in God, is the internal source of action moving monads. God's moved by his wisdom to act in the most perfect way, not only in a metaphysical but in a moral sense. Correspondingly, the perceptions in the monad arise from each other according to the laws of the appetites, or the final causes of good and evil. Only rational creatures can recognize themselves and so consciously will in this way, and it's not the case that they always do so. As with simple monads, rational souls move spontaneously, guided from perception to perception by a tendency toward the apparent good. In this way, Leibniz says appetites operate in substances in the same way that efficient causes operate to create changes in phenomena. We're led toward pleasure by appetites, and pleasure, Leibniz believes, is a sense of perfection. The appetites move substances based on the perception of apparent perfection, We must remember, however, that it's only apparent. To the extent that we act on information provided by the senses, we're likely instead to move toward imperfection or pain. Thus, Leibniz says that because sense perceptions are confused, enjoyment of the senses must be used according to the rules of reason, like food, medicine, or exercise. But the pleasure which the soul finds in itself through understanding is true joy. Now, we all know that. It's ignorance, then, or confused perception, that moves substances away from the good. And this is not true of rational souls only, for there's spontaneity in the confused as well as in the distinct. For Leibniz, perception and appetite exist throughout nature, since the nature of things is uniform, and our nature cannot differ infinitely from other simple substances of which the whole universe consists. Leibniz. In the case of will, then, as in the cases of knowledge and power, God's perfections are the cause of the perfection in the world. A fact that we fail to see when we fail to notice the wonderful ways in which the metaphysical laws of cause, power, and action are present throughout all nature, and how they predominate over the purely geometric laws of matter themselves. Now, the perfection of the world. That was monads, now we're doing the world. Leibniz's most provocative claim, as well as his most highly recognized view, is that the actual world is the best of all possible worlds. It's this view that requires long defense from Leibniz, and that motivated what turned out to be the only book published during his lifetime. With respect to the world, as with respect to individuals, Leibniz offers at least two apparently different sorts of account of its perfection. For one, Leibniz sometimes speaks of the most perfect world as that which possesses the most essence, or being, just as he does with respect to individual monads. Alternatively, he describes the most perfect world as that which is simplest in hypotheses and richest in phenomena. This last has sometimes been interpreted to mean that the most perfect world is that which provides the best trade-off between some number of hypotheses, or simplicity, and richness of phenomena, or variety. Some authors, though, have understood this phrase to mean that God creates a maximal number of monads and phenomena through the simplest laws. No version of either of these kinds of accounts, in my estimation, has it exactly right. As I will argue below, while for Leibniz God does create the most monads possible through the simplest laws, the world that arises does not necessarily contain the most phenomena. Rather, it contains the richest or most complete, that is, most richly and variously expressed phenomena possible. Let's start, though, with the interpretation of the most perfect world as that which possesses the most reality, the most essence possible. Leibniz characterizes the situation thus. You've got this on your page. Since something rather than nothing exists, there's a certain urge for existence, or, so to speak, a straining toward existence in possible things, or in possibility, or in essence itself. In a word, essence in and of itself strives for existence. Furthermore, it follows from this that all possibles, that is, everything that expresses essence of possible reality, strives with equal right for existence, in proportion to the amount of essence or reality or degree of perfection they contain. For perfection is nothing but amount of essence. The essence in question, as we saw in the section above, is the quantity of God's perfections to be found in a particular possible. The greater the participation in these perfections, the more essence a possible substance possesses, and the greater claim it has on existence. According to Rescher, the merit or worthiness of the substance for actualization, its quantity of essence or potentiality for existence, is directly proportional to its perfection. It seems to me from the passage cited, though, that rather than quantity of essence being proportional to the perfection in a possible, the perfection in a possible substance, as Leibniz actually says, is nothing but the amount of essence in it. And the perfection of a world, in turn, is the totality of essence possessed by a system of substances, with the actual world, of course, possessing more than any other collection possible. That is, the perfection of the world just is the total amount of God's perfection or essence accruing to that world. So Leibniz describes the existence as that series of possibles which involves more of reality and whatever enters into it. Mercer's reading of Leibniz, which characterizes creation in terms of divine emanation, carries within it the implication that the most essence possible will be created, because on her view, all of God's attributes are expressed in every creature, and every possible degree of instantiation of those attributes is included in the created world. Whether reading with Mercer or not, she thinks that the difference between individuals that exist in the world just is the amount of those total essences that anybody expresses. So everybody's basically the same, only more intense or less intense. Whether reading with Mercer or not, perfection in this sense once again refers us to God's perfections and the degree to which individual substances share in them. Continuing in the text cited above, Leibniz says, just a second one in this section, from this it is obvious that of the infinite combinations of possibilities and possible series, the one that exists is the one through which the most essence or possibility is brought into existence. In practical affairs, one always follows the decision rule in accordance with which one ought to seek the maximum or the minimum. Namely, one prefers the maximum effect at the minimum cost, so to speak. This suggests that the characterization of the most perfect world in terms of that which possesses the most essence or reality, rather than competing with, gives rise to that most familiar depiction of the world as the one which is at the same time simplest in hypotheses and richest in phenomena. Likewise, the most perfect world, understood in terms of simplicity of hypotheses and richness of phenomena, gives rise to the world that possesses the most essence or reality. That is, both of these characterizations imply each other. The reason that the perfection of the world is defined in terms of simplicity of hypotheses appears to be Leibniz's commitment to the intelligibility of the universe, which in turn seems to be wrapped up with God's notion of the good, or God's goodness in creation. Simplicity of laws implies elegance in achieving order. And as concerns order, Leibniz says, Discourse Metaphysics 6, everything is in conformity with it. In fact, it isn't even possible to imagine anything irregular. And in the next section, he says that God's most general will conforms with the most perfect order which he has chosen. The very best world, then, is the world with maximal order, which is also the world with maximal harmony. Perfect harmony, in fact, because perfect harmony just is unity in variety. Leibniz also says, however, that harmony is the principle that the greatest possible quantity of essence exists. This seems to imply that the more order that exists, the more being it's possible to pack in to one place. That's certainly true with respect to physics. Consider what happens as a liquid's cooled. Particles move more slowly, more order is created, and the liquid becomes denser. In other words, more stuff is contained in the same space. If this works, then the world that's the most orderly or most harmonized would also be the world that contains the most being. And the world which is perfectly harmonized, as Leibniz says the actual world is the world that is completely full. That is, the world that contains maximal being. Now, since we've considered the perfection of the world in terms of its degree of being, and we've seen that degree of being implies unity and multiplicity and vice versa, let's turn to directly to this second description. To begin, we should notice that the interpretation of this characterization is complicated, as Greg Brown points out, by the obscurity of the terms in which it's phrased. Thus, there has arisen disagreement. See, I just know you won't believe that there's disagreement in Leibniz scholars among something like splitting hairs. You heard the first 18 pages of it. Okay, there's disagreement among scholars on both the meanings of simplicity of laws and richness of phenomena. With respect to the first, it's unclear whether the simplest laws are the most universal ones, that is, those that admit the fewest exceptions, or whether they're the most simply stated laws. It seems reasonable to side with those who understand simplest in terms of universality, as the simplest laws would seem to be those that reconcile apparently disparate cases under one formula. Brown worries that laws that absorb exceptions like this will be complex, though, in the ordinary sense, but I don't see that that's necessarily the case. As in the example cited in a letter from Leibniz to Malebranche in July of 1687, apparently aberrant cases can often be reconciled simply by formulating one's laws more elegantly, or by looking at things in a different way. There, Leibniz says, rest can be considered as an infinitely small velocity, or as an infinite slowness. Therefore, whatever is true of velocity or slowness in general should be verifiable also of rest taken in this sense, so that the rule for resting bodies must be considered as a special case of the rule for motion. If this doesn't work, he continues, that's a certain sign that the laws are wrongly formulated. Simplicity in this sense, or elegance then, is in fact one criterion by which new scientific theories are judged to be better than old ones. And it is at any rate what Leibniz says that God, the perfect geometrician, does, not only in geometry, but in physics as well. I think he anticipates something like paradigm shift, when you have bad theory, you get too many aberrations, you have to think of it in a different way, then you can subsume it under simpler laws. Now, also in dispute is the other term in the criterion perfection, richness in phenomena, or alternatively, the greatest variety. The question here is whether the greatness or richness under discussion is in the variety of kinds of phenomena or in the number of phenomena. The more frequently encountered view is what Leibniz intends is that God produces with the simplest hypotheses is the greatest variety of types of phenomena. David Blumenfeld, however, has argued that God produces the greatest number of individual phenomena. In fact, he maintains that God produces the greatest number of individuals, both phenomena and monads. This dispute, however, is related to the question of the relationship between simplicity of hypotheses and variety in phenomena, so it's to the latter that I will now turn. The most widely accepted reading of this criterion of perfection is that there's some kind of trade-off between simplicity of means and richness of product. Rescher, Gale, Brown, each have opted for this interpretation of Leibniz's view. While they differ significantly in the specifics of how they think the optimal mix is to be determined, in general, they're all of the opinion that some variety, some richness is going to have to be sacrificed if God's to achieve that richness through the simplest laws. David Blumenfeld and Kathleen O'Krollick, on the other hand, argue that no trade-off is necessary, for in God's hands, the simplest hypotheses by their very nature give rise to the greatest variety in phenomena. I incline towards something like the latter two views, which differ from each other significantly, but I believe that neither of these interpreters has it exactly right. And then this section I'll outline what I take to be a better way of understanding Leibniz's conception of the best world possible. O'Krollick argues that simplicity in itself engenders fecundity. She makes her point with an example about fencing in of an area of pasture. Suppose I've given an amount of fencing, suppose I have a given amount of fencing material with which I hope to enclose a maximum amount of area. I can achieve this end by employing the simplest geometrical formula for a closed curve, the formula for a circle. The simplest law in this case is also the one which maximizes area. Well, that may be the case, but her analogy suggests nothing about variety. While she's correct that her analogy accommodates Leibniz's statements to Malebranche that any world but the one built from simplest laws would have been like a building of round stones, which leave more space unoccupied than what they fill, making the case that it is in fact reflective of Leibniz's view would require both further elaboration and argumentation. Blumenfeld, who also believes that simplicity is productive, provides a more detailed account. According to him, Leibniz believes that God creates not fewer, but simpler laws, and further, holds that through their operation on both noumenal and phenomenal levels, and based on God's creating the maximal number of monads, not only is variety in kinds of phenomena maximized, but so is the number of things created altogether. By simple, Blumenfeld means that a law not only approaches complete freedom from exception, but also that its architect time in nature. That is, it makes the most efficient use of whatever aspect of being it covers. Through the use of maximally efficient laws, Blumenfeld maintains that for Leibniz, God uses a multiplicity of simple laws. In fact, he thinks God's got the most of everything. He says the largest consistent set of laws. The most monads, most phenomena, the most laws. He just says that God doesn't use any gratuitous laws to derive the development of the largest number of monads to maximize the number and variety of the phenomena. The irresistible question here is just what the largest number of monads or the most monads means for Blumenfeld. The only thing that comes to mind for an infinite creator is the largest logically consistent number, or the largest compossible set. If that's so, as Blumenfeld admits, then it would seem that there could conceivably remain an equally numerous set that is not chosen, not because it has fewer monads, but on the ground that it uses more complex laws, generating a less rich phenomenal order. But then the best, the chosen world, wouldn't be distinguishable simply on the basis of its having the most monads, which was Blumenfeld's criterion. Although Blumenfeld suggests a possible answer to the problem he raises against his own reading, that perhaps Leibniz holds that analogous to the way in which maximal phenomenal being is a function of simplicity of phenomenal laws, maximal simplicity of developmental laws would naturally and necessarily result in a maximum of monads. This, although conjectural rather than textual, says Blumenfeld, would plug the hole in Leibniz's argument for the most monads. But given the complete lack of textual evidence for Leibniz holding this view, the strength of the argument supporting his resolution is questionable. Brown adds that the additional objection to this reading, that since monads are causally isolated from each other, it's difficult to see how the simplicity or complexity of these laws in each monad could possibly determine whether other monads were compossible or incompossible with one another. Mercer's more convinced than either a Kralik or a Blumenfeld, and more radical in her understanding, that the most perfect world derives maximal richness from maximal simplicity. On her view of immanent causation, God just is both the unity from which monads and derivatively all phenomena arise. Next to the last quote. According to Mercer, that the one is the multiplicity in the created world is fairly straightforward. When the one overflows, it necessarily produces a multiplicity in that the being and perfection of the one is manifested in diverse ways. The one exists in the multiplicity in the sense that it's immanent in its products. On this account, there can be no doubt of the simplicity of hypotheses governing the creation of the world. A single hypothesis would certainly be maximally simple. And there could be no question of a tension between unity and multiplicity, for they're the same thing. Both are God. God's unity emanates to each of its products and thereby produces a unified and real thing. Because God is a unity, the beings that God emanates are unities as well. Additionally, Mercer says God's unity emanates to the totality of created things and thus produces an interrelated whole. Now, Mercer says that others may use the language of simplicity or identity and diversity or variety, but she declares that for the purposes of her argument, these differences in terminology are not significant. Well, perhaps they're not, but the language of decrees and hypotheses that Leibniz uses does seem oddly out of place in her account. God's emanating his nature to every created being seems importantly different from God's choosing to create beings based on certain principles. As I've mentioned, it seems to me that those who argue that the simplest laws, rather than competing with or having to be balanced with the greatest or richest variety, stand on the correct side of this dispute. In a letter to Malebranche, Leibniz says that God makes the maximum of things that he can, and what obliges him to seek simple laws, is precisely the necessity to find place for as many things as can be put together. If he makes use of other laws, it would be like, we've heard, trying to make a building with round stones, which makes use more space than they occupy. It's just this kind of elegance that Leibniz seems to have in mind when he equates harmony with unified variety, with maximal essence. Finding maximal unison among a variety of phenomena would not only create the most order, but would, as argued above, also result in the maximum amount of room for packing things in. Although I agree with Blumenfeld that this implies that God creates the world with the maximal number of monads, what seems wrong to me in Blumenfeld's account, besides the fact that he never explained what he meant by maximal number of monads, is his conclusion that God must therefore create the maximal number of phenomenal things. Rather than this, Leibniz seems to intend that God creates the world with phenomena whose richness is maximal. That is, those phenomena reflected from maximally various perspectives. If order is harmony, this is me, and perfect order is perfect harmony, then the most perfectly harmonious world, which Leibniz says the actual world is the world that allows for the maximum number of created substances possible. Since this is a world created by one who acts perfectly, creating a world constituted of the most perfect beings of all, those that occupy the least volume and least interfere with one another, it would seem that this world is packed to the point of completeness. Now, while I don't know just how many substances this would be, it would have to amount to an infinity of infinities, for it seems clear that it would be the number that would provide every possible perspective on every phenomenon, including the expression in every other substance of every phenomenon. This would provide the most maximally rich phenomena, since it would create those with the maximal possible number of perceivable perspectives. These would also be those phenomena with the most variety in the same sense and for the same reason. And all of these, harmonized as they are, would thus give rise to the maximally harmonious world, as all the perceptions of all these substances are coordinated so that they create one single world. This seems to be what Leibniz intends when he says, this is your very last quote, get ready to hooray. The marvelous thing is that the supreme wisdom has found the means through representative substances of varying the same world in infinite ways at the same time. For the world, already having within it infinite variety and being varied such that it is expressed in diverse ways by an infinity of different representations, receives an infinity of infinities, and it could not better correspond to the nature and intentions of its inexpressible author, who surpasses in perfection everything that can be thought about him. Okay, now, the punchline. Having said how I think Leibniz understands the created world to be constituted, we can finally return to the issue with which we began, the status and perfectibility of the inferior monads, and their relation to the theological optimism that pervades and seems even to motivate Leibniz's system. To begin, let's return to Mercer. One element of Mercer's reading that seems absolutely right is her view that Leibniz assumes something like what she calls the enhancement relation, which claims that an increase in the goodness of one being will promote an increase in the goodness of those beings with which it has an enhancement relation. From which it follows that an increase in the goodness of any mind will be reflected in the increase in the goodness of every other mind. Based on this fundamental relation and the relation of mutual expression, which she introduces as the theory of reflective harmony, both of which phenomena I say exist among all individual substances, rather than just minds, the world, it would seem, is set up perfectly to constantly increase in perfection. Let's examine this process. We've established that Leibniz equates perfection with distinctness of perception and with degree of essence, or participation in God's perfection, in particular knowledge, power, and will. Power we've seen characterized in terms of influence over the world or activity. But activity Leibniz equates with increase in distinctness of perception. Knowledge we've seen characterized in terms of the informational content of perceptions. Once again, this perfection is increased to the extent that degree of distinctness is, perception is increased. Will we've seen characterized as appetition or movement toward the good or increased perfection. This movement is only toward the apparent good in created beings. The mistakes here are a function of confused perceptions. So yet again, we find degree of perfection to be a function of distinctness of perception. It would seem then that all perfection in all senses either amounts to or is correlated or identified with distinctness of perception. Let's do that again. It would seem then that perfection in all senses is either correlated or identified with distinctness of perception. Further, it would appear that all beings capable of perception would necessarily be involved in any increase in perfection, understood in this way. Finally, it seems clear from his many references to the pleasure it brings to rational beings that in Leibniz's mind, created substances do increase in perfection, because for conscious beings, awareness of perfection amounts to pleasure, and Leibniz talks about that a lot. Thus, we can conclude that all substances are involved in this increasingly more perfect world, for Leibniz says that the highest perfection possible is obtained for all things, and therefore also for minds. In this instance, even mentioning the totality before referring to minds. And Leibniz apparently believes that the perfection of the world can increase ad infinitum, for we don't know how far our knowledge and our organs can be developed in the course of eternity, which lies before us. Given that the increase in the perfection of some created beings is reflected in all others, those others' perceptions are thereby increased in perfection as well. Thus, it would seem impossible for the rational creatures, whose happiness is of such concern to God, to increase in perfection without all the lesser beings doing so as well, although the latter would lack awareness of it. What's more, if the created universe is completely full, as we've seen that it has to be for Leibniz, then if only rational beings increase in perfection, gaps would be left in the continuum of perfection that distinguishes one monad from another. So, unless both Leibniz system is inconsistent in its employment of the principle of the continuum, and God is unjust in the distribution of increase in perfection, we must conclude that simple monads as well as rational beings do increase in perfection, and what's more, have the potential for indefinitely doing so. Thank you for your patience. This is, by the way, part of a larger thing where you have to also argue that God would want those monads to increase because God has motivation for that, and that, the fact that God cares about the happiness of creatures above all other things doesn't undermine anything that I've said, because if the other non-self-aware monads increase to the point of self-awareness, then they'll be happy too, and why would you care about the happiness of something that doesn't even recognize that it's happy to begin with? So, there's a bunch of crap that still has to be said, basically, but you can see it takes a lot of saying to say anything about life.
I have a question. Just for clarification, what does distinctness of perception mean? Or is that like?
Well, that was one of the big questions, wasn't it? There's a simple definition. Leibniz says, as opposed to clarity,
when I put my glasses on.
if you can understand why, things fit together, yeah. Because he says distinction, and most places he says is marked by your ability to say what separates one thing from another thing, so that you could make somebody else be able to recognize it later. Sometimes he talks in lesser terms. Distinctness is a perception that stands out in relief with respect to other perceptions. But it has to do with access to the order, that is, to making sense of the place of things.
And so I guess what's a little mystifying here to me is what that has to do with activity as opposed to passivity and
Well,
power, right?
yeah.
I mean, there doesn't, at least on the face of it, doesn't seem to be any sort of connection between being active and seeing the world better.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's because of this. If the world's a plenum, and if every increase in distinctness of perception in one place has to be accompanied by a decrease in distinctness of perception somewhere else.
because there's got to be the same total amount at all times.
Actually, that's not exactly true, but what happens, because the universe does progress over time,
Okay.
right? But in the meantime, like at one time, increase in distinctness on one part is coordinated with a concomitant decrease on the part of somebody else. So that if I speak and I am clear about what's coming out of my mouth, what's going to come next, and what the reasons are, then just to the extent that I am the reason for my understanding this and all of these words coming out, you have to be coordinated with me to accept that. So anytime anybody dances forward, somebody else has got to dance backward. So, right, and since that all happens internally to everybody, it's cashed out in terms of one being the reason for, that is, the more active being becomes the reason for some change somewhere else. So it's whoever has to accommodate whom, right? So, and who's going to decide that? Well, it's going to be decided based on where the reasons are. So sufficient reason for you to dance backward is that I'm dancing forward.
And wouldn't it also be vice versa then?
Well, sure, it happens. I don't know what you mean. That your dancing backward be sufficient
Why wouldn't
reason
that
for-
be active? Yeah, why wouldn't that be my active, like, or in the other example, couldn't my lack of distinct perceptions
be the cause of my.
force you to explain it to me, right? And wouldn't that make, why wouldn't that make you passive, I guess?
Well, because if assertion of one's existence, activity is reflected in terms of godlike kind of perfection and seeing things clearly, you can't make me understand your misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
You can ask me. So assertion of power is always that the spontaneity on one side is involved, right?
Mm-hmm. So I mean, passivity is defect then.
Yeah. Yeah, it is because something else is the reason for your having to accommodate. Right? So somebody else is being more godlike and asserting more omniscience. Okay?
So there's that passage just before the section of perfection of the world where it said from God's point of view, simple substances are active if looked at from one way and passive if looked at another. But that's about simple substances, and your example with Mark is about two complex substances. Or is it the case that when he doesn't understand something and you explain it to him, seen from one point of view, you're active and then he's passive, but if you step back a cause and look at him prompting you, now you're passive and he's active? Is it just depends on what's within what two events you're looking at to decide what's active and what's passive? Or does that just apply to simple substances?
Well, no, I mean, because that's all there are, right?
Oh, okay.
Simple substances. And so minds, like rational minds like us, are simple substances just as much are the monads, that there are a bazillion of them in your tip of your little fingernail, right? So if that's all there are, that just means that, I mean, the reason that we are so much more powerful than these other little tiny monads, right, is because we perceive things more clearly. We have, therefore, more control over what we're doing. understand the connections of things, we know how to do stuff better. So with respect to this quotation, whatever is active in certain respects is passive, considered from another point of view. Active insofar as what we distinctly know and it serves as a reason for what happens somewhere else, but passive insofar, that is, since any one of our perceptions is focused on something and is distinct somewhere and accompanied by an infinity of confused perceptions somewhere else, if I'm active with respect to my understanding of this math problem, then I'm passive with respect to, the truck that's coming up behind me, something that's, slapping me in the back of the head. So you can be active and passive with respect, from different perspectives at the same time, because there's always in any particular perception lots of stuff going on. Dave?
I had one question. So for Spinoza, the perfect world would be both the most being and the simplest, but that seems to be a contradiction, especially with the amazing amount of monads being, it seems like that's more complex than simple. Like an amoeba would be more simple than a human being, even though a human being would be more, I guess, full than an amoeba would be. So I'm kind of seeing a clash there.
You mean that
justly I am, but
that for Spinoza, the system is simplest because everything just is God, whereas for Leibniz, the system is.
Oh, I meant for Leibniz. I'm sorry. Sorry.
Okay, then let's go back. Let me do that one more time.
Sorry. I get confused with these rationalists. Being the most
If
being.
it's not Hume, he doesn't do that.
Being like the most being and being the simplest.
Yeah.
For Leibniz, it seems like that would be inherently contradictory because having more of something seems to make it more complex, that there's more nuances, there's different things, whereas being simple would mean that there's less, at least from where I'm looking at it. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but.
Two things, I think. One, if you look at it from the perspective of God, and you can use that's why I thought you were going to Spinoza, because if everything just is one thing, which is kind of how Mercer just wants to have God emanating itself, everywhere. And if everything just is one thing, then you've got unity in multiplicity. You've got one unbreakable thing, right? Like in Spinoza's system, can't take any parts out, but it contains absolutely everything. So it is as rich as is possible, right? Another thing is, when we think of encompassing the most, the reason that there are paradigm shifts in the history of science is because another way of looking at things or another way of framing things can often encompass and account for more in a one simpler way of doing it, right? So that you can encompass more the simpler your explanation is. And sometimes we know about that because we know when people have to do ad hoc this, ad hoc that, ad hoc this, and whatever, and you go, you know what? This is just a case of blah, 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 and then everything is encompassed into one thing, right? So unity can be most productive, I think. And producing, what Leibniz says about producing just minds, he finds that those are ultimately simple because you can't break a mind and still have it, right? And so you've just got these unities, but look at all the variety that can take place in one mind. All the stuff you've gone through in the last hour. Minds can do a lot and they don't have to interfere with each other. Well, and they don't in this case at all. So you can do a lot. Amanda.
In the discussion of the phenomena and the dispute between maximally various phenomena and the maximum number of phenomena, given the law of identity being that if two things are exactly the same, then they're really the same thing, what's the difference between the greatest variety of phenomena and the greatest number of phenomena?
That's a good question. It depends on how big you draw your varieties. or how broadly you define species, right? Because it looks like what Blumenfeld thinks he's arguing against is people who say, well, you know, you got dogs, you got explosions, you got astronomical events, you got people, and if you draw your species like that broad, you could have innumerable cases of each of which would still be individual, right? So he's gonna think, and of course it is, you know, if you draw your species as narrow as you can, as some people say that Leibniz does, you know, and he certainly does with respect to individual concepts, then absolutely every individual is a species of its own, and you can't even talk about sameness in kind without having identities. So I think you gotta sort of relax your
Concept of
boundaries,
variance,
yeah, and have sort of larger species.
So this is probably a quick question for you to answer, but there was that early quote that said that you know, for the greatest of all numbers as well as the greatest of all figures, that implies a contradiction, but the greatest knowledge and omnipotence do not involve any impossibility. Well, wouldn't knowledge include the knowledge of what the number of all numbers is, or I mean, why doesn't, if we can know numbers, why doesn't the impossibility of there being a largest number infect our perfection of our knowledge?
Well, because the knowledge isn't of the largest number.
It's just knowing that there's no limit to
It
numbers?
knows that there can't be,
Oh,
right?
that's a cop. You should know that last number.
But if the last number is a contradiction in itself, then that knowledge that it's a contradiction is pretty sharp,
Okay,
right? It took all the way to Galileo.
yeah, okay. I
Fast.
think it would be fast.
Don't start. Say anything? Yeah, Paul was asking very hard questions.
Can I ask you a very easy question?
You don't know what that is.
So are you now at the point where you would say that the bare monads, the souls, and the minds do not constitute separate metaphysical castes, but rather are, as it were, different maturity levels?
I have to say
The
that
monadic infants, the monadic adolescents, and the monadic adults.
I have to say that because another paper that I published a few years ago that sort of connects to this raised the question of how could you have something different in kind? How could you have species demarcations? And particularly my question was, how could rational beings be different in kind in the way that, you know, this talk about the city of God, and God only cares about these creatures, and, you know, rational mind is worth an infinity of others, and the rational mind is worth the whole world, and all that, and God only cares about the felicity and happiness of rational souls. There's all this kind of talk, and yet, on a principle of a continuum, you cannot do that. There is no way to get those to come out of a continuum, because Leibniz says you just, you know, you can draw your lines anywhere you want to, but that's about you. That's not about what exists. And if there really is this continuum of perfection, then what I envision is that the universe, as it continues to progress, and on this enhancement principle, as the smarter monads are reflecting more distinctly, more clearly, right, then the universe that there is reflecting to be reflected in the next, like us, maybe the next level monads, is already more perfect. So our perceptions are already more perfect than they were just by virtue of hanging out with these people and having to express the same universe, because they're doing it better, so we have to do it better. But if you've got a continuum and you can't have any gaps, then that means that every single monad is having to perceive better. And so even the bare monads that approach this level of, you know, confused perception to the point of non-perception, to the point of perfect stupor, have to be pulled up, right, all the time. So they cannot be different in kind, and there are many passages where Leibniz says that they are not different in kind, and that there's no way of talking about them in those terms. And so I have to talk about them in maturity level. And given, you know, an eternity of maturation, I have to say that there is not a way to make a distinction that would prevent inferior monads from becoming apperceptive at some point and rational at some point, and then you know what happens? Happy, right? So then they even get to the point where they can be self-aware and happy, and so that, yeah. And you don't lose monads, you just pull the whole thing up. And that's why I said I think Leibniz, you know, when Voltaire laughs at him, the best of all possible worlds, ha ha ha. Oh no, not even that. Leibniz has got this best of all possible worlds that can't help but get better and better and better. Infinite. Sam?
Leibniz is Hegel.
Yeah,
Oh.
or Hegel sees something, but
Well, that has the same. The worst of all possible worlds can't do anything but get better either,
that's right. Well, if it's,
because there's nowhere to go but up.
yeah, but it could never get started.
Well, the worst possible might be what is the best and becomes the worst.
You can't get there from there.
It's a one-way
The best,
road.
yeah,
Only
it's a
up,
one-way trip.
only up escalator.
That's boring.
The reason
You can try to run down,
Well,
What?
but the security guard will bounce.
well, part of the reason I asked was just to verify that it was true, but then the further agenda would be that I know who's interested in the question, and so I assume you might be interested in speaking to the question of the fact that there's at least an apparent tension between metaphysical goodness and moral goodness. Insofar as one might ask, for moral purposes, what's the point of all these dumb monads? Given that all these things that he says about the much greater grace of all these smarter folk. So, can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, that's why I think theologically he's more optimistic than, even people who want to make fun of him would say, because the point of these monads is, first, that they contribute to the best of all possible worlds. They contribute to the most perfect world. And here's the thing. The reason I think God, the real thing that Leibniz says about why does God create anything? God creates anything so that his glory can be reflected, right? So he creates this perfect, the best possible world that's packed, with everything that can possibly exist at the same time, so that it can maximally reflect this goodness. But it's going to maximally reflect God's goodness more if the more perfect monads become more perfect and the dumber monads become more distinct in their reflection. And if everything is getting more distinct in its reflection, then it's all more perfectly expressing God. So there's all that. So the purpose for creating something better other than nothing to begin with is maximized if the inferior monads have the potential to improve. So God would be undermining his own project if he didn't want to do that.
Well, there's the fact that there are more, empty seats in the heavenly choir that stand to be filled.
Yes.
How about, though, that the existence of the dumber monads is in some sense or other necessary for the moral improvement of the smarter monads and vice versa?
Well, maybe it's for them too, right? Because the smart, what Paul's, a couple of things Paul's referring to, but one of the things I can speak to about what Paul's referring to is Leibniz's claim that we improve in perfection and we become happier to the extent that we understand order better and to the extent that we see how things fit together better. And he says that it doesn't matter whether we hear musical harmonies, whether we see artistic harmonies, whether we study math, or whether we study nature and find these principles or rules governing these regularities in nature. We improve our understanding, we improve our insight through all of these ways. But you couldn't have violins and art objects and nature if you don't have the simple, stupid monads to get a world going, so that there's something reflected for the smart monads to think about other than themselves, right? So that they can then find this order, so that they can then improve themselves and get happy about it. See, this is a way optimistic, happy thing. This is what I do to get away from life, you know? I just do Leibniz. It's happier and
Do
happier.
the smarter monads make fun of the dumber monads?
They wouldn't dream of it. They're too smart. They're
Oh.
wise. They know that that's.
Oh, they're
not right.
high-minded.
Yes, that's right. The smarter you get, the more high-minded you are.
Oh.
They just what?
But the teenage monads.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they bootstrap them. You know, they wouldn't make fun of them.
Okay.
They're not like teenage monads, right? They're
Oh.
more like wise monads.
Oh,
Now they
okay.
might jive them a little bit like Socrates, because that's necessary for their own good.
They don't make up mean nicknames.
No, they don't call them the stinky and stuff like that. What's that? You like that one? Yeah, me too.
Yeah, stinky monads.
Sam?
This is an entirely ignorant question. I mean, quite sincerely. But
Don't listen.
Let's start
Okay,
it
so
first.
go in any
He's trying to
crap
pull
here.
you down.
If you wait long enough, it'll get better.
is the monad self-aware?
Rational monads only.
And a monad that is not self-aware engages in self-improvement only because that's the gravity of reason, and so that's the nature of things.
Even brutes though, I mean, if you wanna, we don't have to go to the level of, you know, fingernail monads or whatever to do this, because you can think of, animal monads, right, the dominant monad in animals seek pleasure. And they seek something that is an apparent good. And they remember that yesterday the can opener meant food. And so, you know, today they hear the can opener and they go for food. So even they are, right, they're improving themselves. That doesn't mean that they're aware of themselves as the beings who are improving themselves. But nevertheless, they are still, I mean, in addition to that, participating in reflecting what's already improving as a function of the smart monads. That's why they're privileged. Now, the smart monads start everything, right? They're self-aware, so they're able to generate the system that everybody else sort of depends on.
If the monad that is self-aware, is it in any way independent from the system that draws it towards self-improvement?
It depends on how you mean it, because every monad is absolutely dependent on the system in the sense that it is a member of a series, and in the other way, since monads are causally completely independent, you know, Leibniz says that God could make a world of just one monad, and it would be exactly the same with perceptions unfolding and all of that, but without all that, the other monads, you know, reflecting it, it would be like a dream, right? Like one-dimensional, because it would just be like mine. So, you know, the answer is yes, both. Every monad is absolutely dependent on every other for its experience of the world, and absolutely no monad is ever dependent on any other monad.
Back to the idea of like passivity with the monad, isn't it? I mean, if you can look at it from a perspective, no matter how you do it, that it would be passive rather than active, even though in one way it might be active. It seems like everything is in a sense passive.
Every created monad is, in a sense, passive.
So doesn't that, I mean, that brings about the whole idea of morality, if that would be a fair thing if you're not active. If it's everything's passive and you're being lifted up in this, you know, elevator, or however you want to put it, that there's nothing that you can really do, per se, to not go up. I mean, you basically are forced into a situation that I think, I mean, it's all a Spinoza type thing now, but.
The improvement, though, is because the way you're forced is you bang your head on the wall, and you bang your head on the wall, and then you don't like banging your head on the wall, so you stop banging your head on the wall. So you're forced to get smarter by learning that banging your head on the wall doesn't feel so good. Right? I mean, this is what happens in a universe that's constituted of all these monads that are, right, perceiving the same unified universe. So you can make it take as long as you want to, if you want to resist. You know, but you can like let all the other, because
Resistance is futile.
yeah. Ultimately, the reason though that you will improve is because, you know, the will is determined by stuff like desires and beliefs, and eventually you will to improve, right, to get smarter, because you will get sick and tired of paying the price of being dumber.
Yeah,
Most rationalists do think, right, that you can see why it would be valuable to you to be better.
I was thinking the analogy that you used for the paradigm shift. Why does the paradigm shift happen? Well, because of anomalous data. And so on some lower level, it's sort of banging your head against the wall, and on some higher level, it's because of some sort of this cognitive disequilibrium or discomfort.
It's a pragmatic issue.
Yeah.
It's always pragmatic.
But I mean, on the higher level, it's more
Doesn't work,
complex.
yeah.
And there's so much anomalous
Yeah.
data for the order of things that that you're catapulted in thinking of it another way, and perhaps in a more parsimonious way
Mhm.
to boot.
Yes.
So, and I see a very developmental model.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, this
That's process
maturation.
philosophy here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. And that's why, right? Because this isn't helping me understand anything, it's not working, so what can we do? You get pushed and then you go, well, wait a minute, this is a simpler explanation for this, or this will work better. I think so. All right, anybody who wants to, you're certainly welcome to stay for class, because I'm not moving, I'm still doing lines for another hour and 15. The people will walk in, the other people you're certainly welcome to walk out. And don't forget to eat stuff, but thank you for listening to this. I know how painful it is. I tell this to my classes all the time. At every Leibniz, at every APA conference and everything, people do all the modern papers and they all go, yeah. And the Leibniz paper comes up and everybody goes, and it never fails. So I appreciate your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.